So welcome to China Institute's Pieces of China, an online series that tells the story of China one object at a time. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs at China Institute, and I am so honored to be joined today by one of the leading experts on China and climate change, Barbara Finamore, who founded the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council's office in Beijing. And the object that Barbara has chosen is called the Beijing Declaration. And it was a document that was produced from China's first, if I'm not mistaken, she'll tell us, International Climate Conference in 1991. So Barbara, come on up and let's start our conversation. Hi, Barbara.
Hey, Dinda, how are you?
Hi. Great. So happy to have you. So Barbara, let's start the conversation back in 1991. That June, Barbara, you snuck into a very important conference in Beijing, right? So what were you doing there and why? Tell us about that.
Dinda, I actually started my career 40 years ago this month as an environmental litigator and advocate in Washington, D.C. And I did that for about 10 years. And then I'd probably still be doing that if I hadn't married a U.S. diplomat. And in 1990, of all places, found myself living in Beijing. Well, I had no idea what to do with myself there, but I wanted to find a job and it was none to be found. So one day I was driving my car down the Third Ring Road, and there were very few private cars then, still mostly bicycles. I saw this banner on the Kunlun Hotel, and it said, Ministerial Conference of Developing Countries on Environment and Development. Well, there was no way I was going to drive by there. I did a U-turn. I pulled into the basement garage. I came up in the elevator only to find that Premier Li Peng was speaking in the ballroom, and there were security guards arm in arm, barring every door. And just to show how desperate I was to get a job, there was no way I was going to let that stop me, and I somehow managed to sneak in. And it was important for me personally, as well as in China's climate future, because I had been trying to reach the head of the UN development program in China for months, and he was in the room. There, by the way, there was nobody from any developed country allowed in the room. I was the only one, except folks from these international organizations. So he thought I must have been important, because the next day he offered me a job. I worked for the UN for 5 years, and during that time met so many young leaders in China who went on to become the heads of China's climate programs in every organization.
Okay, wow. So at that moment, though, China's, dial us back in history. Basically, if I understand correctly, China's position was, we are part of the developing world. Climate and the environment are not our problem. They are problems that are created by the developed world, and that's basically our stance. Is that right?
That had been China's stance since the first environmental conference in Stockholm in 1972. China saw environmental protection, sustainable development as a barrier to its own economic development.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this particular conference was the first time that China figured out a way to participate in these global treaties without interfering with its its economic development goals. So that's what I happened to step in on. China was developing a joint negotiation strategy with ministers from 41 developing countries that would relieve them of any binding obligations in these global treaties. They developed this term, common but differentiated responsibilities. Very clunky.
Wow. Okay.
What that meant is, for the next few decades, every country was put into one of two groups. Annex 1 developed, Annex 2 developing. Annex 2 countries had no climate obligations. And that made a lot of sense at the time. Developed countries were largely responsible for it. But what happened is, over the years, is that China's emissions kept going up and up and up, but it was still very, tightly linked.
Yep. So I want you to walk us forward in time to what then happened between 1991 and the Paris Agreement of 2015, when China suddenly, maybe from your expert's perspective, it wasn't sudden, but seemed to suddenly reverse itself. China for those years, decades, was doing a lot of polluting, right? While it, as you were saying, prioritized economic growth over environmental concerns, right? So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. And in the Copenhagen Climate Conference, China was widely blamed for the failure of countries to reach an international binding treaty. And if you look at what was happening in China at that time, it makes a lot of sense because in that decade, after China joined the WTO in 2001, it quadrupled its economy. It quintupled its exports.
Wow.
It became the world's manufacturing floor. It launched the largest urbanization program in history, and it was all powered by coal. It tripled its coal consumption. But that would still be the case now, except that China realized during that time that this was not sustainable because coal is the leading source of not only its carbon emissions, but also its devastating pollution. And that reached a head in 2013, the year known as the Airpocalypse, when living in Beijing was like living in an airport smoking lounge. And throughout the country, it was as if every man, woman, and child was smoking 1.3 cigarettes every hour.
Wow.
The government realized it had to do something, and that's when it started to crack down on coal. Once it did that, it was ready to act on climate. And so it participated actively in the Paris Agreement. And there were no binding commitments here, let me say, but every country pledged to do everything it could to peak its CO2 emissions as soon as possible. So this was the breakthrough. And it really was because of the link between air pollution and CO2 emissions.
Right. And that sort of the equation changed, I guess, for the government in China in the sense that the equation had been, we have got to lift our population out of poverty. We have got to develop our economy. And that is not only important for the benefit of our people, but it's also a question of stability and, keeping their hands on power, in terms of the government. And then the Airpocalypse happened in 2013, and suddenly the equation changed, right? Because then, the pollution actually became a political liability.
Absolutely. And they realized that moving towards renewable energy, in which it's now the world leader, was good for them economically. It was good for them politically. It was good for them environmentally. And it's the largest market opportunity of the 21st century. However, after the Paris Agreement, for the first few years, emissions dropped in China, and therefore global emissions stabilized because China is burning as much or emitting as much CO2 as the US and the EU put together. It's by far the world's largest. The thing is that in the past couple of years, however, these emissions and coal consumption has started to creep up again because it is not easy.
Why is it creeping up?
Yeah, it's, local governments continue to believe that growing their GDP is the way to ensure their success. And their whole economies were built on coal. So even though their rating system has changed, they're still continuing to approve and build new coal-fired power plants, even though they're not needed anymore. They're increasingly economic. Solar and wind are cheaper now than coal. But that's what's happening. That's the dynamic. There's also very powerful state-owned enterprises and fossil fuel industry and state grid who don't want to see this transition to low carbon economy. So that's what we've been seeing. That's what we've been seeing in the last few years.
Right. Okay. So as carbon emissions, sorry, say again.
Until last month.
Yes. Okay. So carbon emissions have been creeping up again. And as you said, local officials, for decades now, their promotions, everything about their career was based on GDP growth. And so the government has been trying to sort of change that equation, right? With these top-down policies, has been starting to say, look, your career advancement, local officials, you're going to have to start thinking about the environment, et cetera. But it sounds like it hasn't really sunk in yet. But then, okay, so as you were just saying, September 22nd, Xi Jinping announced to the world that China is going to aim to become carbon neutral before 2060. That's Beijing's first long-term real target, I guess. Was that a surprise? And tell us, was that a big deal?
It was a surprise. I don't think anybody saw that coming, except the people within China, the research institutes who had done all the studies to see whether or not it is actually feasible. That wouldn't have happened. That announcement would not have happened without a lot of work going into it. But I think it took the rest of the world by surprise, given that China's emissions have been going up. It wasn't under any, timetable to do this, although under the Paris Agreement, countries were supposed to take stock this year and strengthen their China pledges.
Mhm.
That said, it is an enormous deal.
Okay, explain why, because there's a lot of cynicism, as you know, in the West. So explain why this is a big deal.
Yes, China has a track record of under-promising and over-delivering on its climate commitments. China, the fact that it was made by President Xi sends a powerful domestic signal. It's not just aimed at a tit for tat with the US and our lack of climate leadership right now. It sends a powerful domestic signal to every government agency, every state-owned enterprise, every company in China. They are already rewriting the 14th five-year plan to take account of this. And that's what is needed in order for us to address this climate problem. Why else is it important? China's leadership, just since this announcement was made, has led 2 other countries to announce net zero emission targets in 2050.
Wow.
Japan last week, South Korea yesterday. This is remarkable because if you count, the EU has already done this in 120 other countries. So if you look at this, you've got the countries together who've announced these net zero emission controls are responsible for half of the world's coal. And if we get a new US administration and they also announce a new net zero target, that's the momentum we need to really tackle this climate crisis.
Okay.
But people are cynical because the devil is in the details. How is China going to achieve this? It's an enormous challenge for a country. It's like turning around the Titanic. China burns half of the world's coal. It produces half of the world's steel and cement. It uses coal directly in those industries. It's the largest importer of crude oil. It's the world's largest auto market. And requiring this is going to entail dramatic changes in China's energy system, in China's land use, and in China's industries and its cities. This is not easy.
Okay. And so talk a little bit about how renewables features into that. I mean, you mentioned earlier that the government sees renewables as part of their strategic economic development plan. So, is it possible that renewables and the sort of green economy can replace their coal economy?
Well, thanks to China, renewable energy is now, it's cheaper to build new solar and wind plants everywhere in the world than to build new coal plants. And in fact, the International Energy Agency just published its annual report last week and says that solar is king and it's the cheapest electricity in history. This is because of China's massive investments and policies and domestic demand. They're bringing the cost down for everybody. Same in wind. They've invested 10 times as much as the US in the last decade. They've brought the cost down over 90%. The difficulty here is there's a lot, this heavy industry, there are no technologies in place yet that are not really expensive for reducing coal use in those heavy industries. So China is now looking to do the same kind of playbook to develop new next generation technologies like hydrogen. And that will in turn bring down the cost for everybody. But Europe doesn't want that. Europe is already investing. They want to be the leader in these offshore wind, in hydrogen. And that's a virtuous cycle. That's the type of competition where everybody benefits.
Interesting. So we're almost up to time, but I have to ask you one, sort of tough question that people often raise, which is, at the same time as all this, good policy is happening from the top down in China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, China is building coal plants, if I'm not mistaken, or is investing in coal plants in other places in the world. So Is that going to stop? What's going on with that?
Yes, China is the largest investor and financier of coal plants overseas, along with Japan and South Korea. I'm hoping that these new commitments will help them to think twice about it. But in fact, these overseas financing is not covered by these domestic net zero targets. What's happening, though, is economics. Because of China's slowing economics and because the pandemic and the slowing economies throughout the world, the investment in these types of fossil fuel infrastructure has dropped by 50% in the first 6 months of this year, while renewable infrastructure has gone up. China just can't really afford that level of financing that it had in mind. Countries can't afford to take on big new investments like this. So that leaves open the room for cheaper renewables to be the next area of focus for not just China, but Europe and the US in helping these recipient countries going forward.
Okay, fingers crossed that will happen. So final question for you, Barbara. You wrote a book called Will China Save the Planet? So can China do that? Can China save the planet is the name of your book. So the question is, will China save the planet? Is China poised to pick up the reins of global climate leadership? And, what's your
this carbon neutral target is the most important step that China could take, but it depends on how it carries through on these details. Even if China were to reach that target, even if it were to include all greenhouse gases, not just carbon, there's a question of how it's to be interpreted. That alone cannot save us from climate catastrophe. It requires every country to step up. But hopefully what we're starting to see is other countries following China's lead, and hopefully the US will restore its own climate leadership. And together we can work together to solve this climate emergency.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I mean, so much of the challenge we are facing right now is trying to add nuance to the conversation about these complicated subjects. And, the misperception in the United States, the idea that China is simply the bad guy, it's so much more complicated than that. And you've really helped us see some of those complexities. So I want to thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time's up. But we're going to bring you back. I promise that we will try to convince Barbara Finamore to come back and talk to us again in greater depth about these incredibly important issues, hopefully next time in person. Please check out all of our Pieces of China episodes on YouTube. We're creating a marvelous mosaic of stories about China, one object at a time. Today's is the Beijing Declaration. And please, I also want to encourage you to become members of China Institute. Your membership, you get great discounts on classes and programs and all kinds of things. But really, more importantly, your support helps us bring brilliant speakers like Barbara Finamore to you, so we can, to our broad array of programs. Barbara, I want to thank you again so much for helping us tell the story of China. We hope to have you back.
Thanks, Dinda. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Barbara. Take care.
Take care.